First of all, let me welcome you to the third session of our training program on socially generative innovation for development. And the topic for today is the social value of innovation. And just a quick reminder that we're doing this collaboratively between Global Stratos and Arizona State University, and it's great to have everybody with us. So just to recap very briefly where we're at. We are focusing on this idea of capabilities and what we are empowering people to be able to do, and how our systems are also constraining what people are able to do, and thinking about how we can adjust both of those through the kinds of innovative practices and technologies that we help bring into being in communities. And just a reminder that capabilities are both internal, in the sense of whether you're talking about an individual or household or community, the kinds of knowledge and the kinds of skills that they have, the kinds of resources that they have access to, as well as lodged in the environment around them, the kinds of things that markets, policies, systems enable and constrain them to be able to do. And we talked last week about how, in particular, technological systems can create feedback loops within, as we think about their kind of complex interactions with different facets of life at the household level, at the community level, and the ways in which those dynamic feedback loops act at times to constrain people, to put limits on their ability to do the things that they need to do in order to make their lives better, and put limits on their abilities to accumulate the resources, access the resources that they need. And so we called this the technology poverty nexus, and it's one of the reasons why technology-led development has not been universally successful in the world, because we have failed to account many times in project design for the ways in which the very systems that we're setting up in an attempt to benefit people actually make it harder for them. And we gave an example of the energy poverty nexus, the way in which energy systems can contribute to that. And we modeled that as a closed loop feedback system, right? In which if there's positive feedbacks in that system, net positive feedbacks in that system, that can lead to growing capabilities, growing resources over time. And we called that generative. Or if there are negative feedbacks in that system that are extracting resources or capabilities over time, that are progressively increasing the limitations and the constraints that households or communities face, we call that extractive. And so this question of the balance that determines that feedback loop, and whether that feedback loop is positive or negative, became conceptually at least very important, right? And we think about that balance as, on the one hand, the kind of net benefits that people are able to achieve as a result of having access to this new technology, on the one hand, and then on the other hand, the costs and the burdens and the risks that come with exercising that energy system to achieve those benefits, and thinking about that as a kind of a tipping point, if you will, in which what's at stake is whether the whole system is generative or extractive. And so you can see the problem here, that if this truly is functioning like this, right, where somewhere around balance, there is this very delicate relationship in which if it tips just the right direction, and we get more net benefits than net costs, burdens, and risks, then that becomes generative fairly quickly. And over time, those positive feedback loops can really reinforce one another and help create thriving and well-being. And vice versa, if it tips just the other direction, that feedback loop becomes negative, and it extracts from that household or the community and creates a descent, right? It progressively limits things more and more over time. So getting this balance right is crucially important, and understanding, the different pieces of that are crucially important. So where I want to start today is to introduce this question of how can we try to put our fingers on this balance, so to speak. How can we try to ensure that we're enabling people to get as significant a benefit as we can from the deployment of new technologies, so that we raise up the benefit side of this balance, and we make this as likely as possible to be a generative outcome. And to do that, I want to talk about this idea of the social value of innovation, which we see in terms of the design and deployment of technology-based projects in ways that enhance and empower people's capabilities. To go back to that fundamental capabilities idea that we've been working with, right? So what is this social value of innovation? How does it work? So I want to talk about 3 strategies for thinking about conceptualizing the social value of innovation here, just really quickly, right? So the first is a mathematical strategy, and I often find it odd because we rarely do computational mathematics on this, although in some sense, if you could do it, that would be great. But so many of the kinds of benefits and costs and risks that we're talking about are intangible in the sense of really hard to kind of measure, at least using the kinds of measurement schemes that we often deploy. And so we lose out on a real ability to quantify this. Nonetheless, my colleagues tell me that this equation is really helpful for folks, right? And so just thinking about the social value of innovation as literally trying to measure the net balance that I was just talking about between benefits and costs and risks and burdens, right? So the benefits that an innovation brings into a household or into a community, minus the costs that it requires to run that, right? So if we're talking about an energy system that runs on a fuel, right? How much does it cost to buy the technology that runs the energy system, to get it installed, to operate it and maintain it? How much does it cost to buy the fuel that we need, right? So there are costs embedded in any technological system. So what are the benefits? What are the costs? And then of course, what are the other risks or burdens that are imposed as well, right? So, time is often associated with the collection of fuel wood or the charging of a battery, right? And so you can think about these things because, we're really trying to understand, not here some narrow understanding of what's going on just in the electricity system, but we're really trying to understand how the electricity system enables or constrains a whole way of living, right? And so thinking about what are those full spectrum benefits on the one hand, and costs and risks and burdens on the other, right? So to me, I actually think it's really quite helpful just to think about this as a net balance kind of equation and make sure that we're paying attention to how can we increase the benefits on the one hand and how can we decrease the costs, but also the additional risks and burdens on the other hand, right? So this is kind of just the basic, simple mathematical approach. It gives us, you know, things to add and subtract in our heads as we're thinking about the social value of innovation. Right, so the second strategy for thinking about the social innovation is the way we think about startup companies. Okay, so there's a methodology called the lean startup value creation strategy, right? And it's all about how do you build a startup company with the kind of least investment possible. And at the idea at the center of the lean startup is some kind of innovation, some kind of new product, new technology, new service that you're bringing into being. And the sorry, I'm getting a little bit of feedback here. So I am, all right, we're good, thanks. So thinking about that startup, right? We've got our innovation, we've got our idea, and the key to a lean startup idea is you want to have what they call the minimum viable product, right? So what is that first, simplest, easiest kind of thing you can put together? It can be really crappy, but you want to get it out there. And if it doesn't work, you're going to pivot. And how do you decide whether it's working or not? Well, it's working or not if people out there are responding positively to it, meaning your customers are responding positively to it because of a fairly simple calculation that they're doing. That is, how much value is your product or your service, your innovation providing to them versus how much does it cost them to buy that product or service from you, right? And the whole idea of a lean startup is if even the crappy version of your new innovation or your new idea or your new service is such that you are, you know, even if your first try at putting this together is such that people see that value in it to them, not to you, right? We spend all this time thinking about business models of our companies, our startup companies, right? Which is all about how are we as a company creating value for ourselves so that we can continue to operate. But the whole crux of the point is if our service, if our technology is providing more value for the user than it's costing us to create it, right? Then there's that gap, right, of value creation for the user. And that's what we call the social value of innovation, right? It's that the product or the service is creating more value in the world for the people who are using it. And that's when you know, right? And that's why sometimes these startup companies have to try 3 or 4 different things before they find that one that is actually creating value, right? Because we have a lot of ideas as scientists and engineers and business people about what should be valuable to other people. The question isn't whether it should be valuable to other people or not. The question is whether it is valuable to other people and whether, and that determination is about whether it helps them accomplish things that they want to do, right? It's back to that basic idea of capabilities. Right? Does it empower them to do things that they want to be able to do? And does it do so at a cost that they're willing to pay, right? So we can think about the social value of innovation as this basic as at the heart of the basic idea of doing a new business startup, right? The idea that you need to create value for your customers. So that's another way to think about the social value of innovation. Is what value are we creating for the customers of the technology systems that we're putting in place, right? And this isn't some intangible value that we wish into being, right? It isn't that we're bringing light into their house and we think, oh, that's amazing. We've lit up their light. We've lit up their life. We've lit up their night. No, this isn't value in our minds, value in their minds, right? And so one of the most interesting things to me about what's happening in the world at the moment is the just unbelievable explosion of interest in solar lanterns. Solar lanterns are quite expensive, and certainly if you measure them on a per watt basis in terms of the solar power versus the cost to get a hold of that solar power, you're talking about, you know, watts at most, maybe sub-watt scale solar generation, right? And, you know, $10, $20, $50 for the lantern, and maybe a few watts of generation. I mean, that's a lot of dollars per watt built into that device, right? So it's some of the most expensive solar energy on the planet. It's being bought in some of the lowest income communities on the planet. People are spending significant fractions of their money, to buy those solar lanterns. Why? Because the value of those lanterns, right? The things that those lanterns are doing in comparison to the alternative, which is kerosene, are just huge, right? There's so many different positivities about solar lanterns. You can hand them to kids without worrying that they're going to catch things on fire. You can hang them around animal pens without worrying that they're going to get knocked over and create a fire, right? You can use them to study and they don't, you know, you're not overheating when you're having to sit next to it. You're not connected to an ongoing corrupt fossil fuel industry that is trying to extract maximum resources from you in order to, you know, sell you kerosene, right? So there's just all kinds of positivities in terms of social value creation, right? That's in the minds of the buyers. They're buying them. They're demonstrating that they're bringing value into their lives, right? So that's the second approach we can use to think about the social value of innovation, is to think about that value creation for the customer. Then there's a third strategy, and I wasn't quite sure what to call this, but something like the diversified outcomes strategy. And here in particular, I'm thinking about SDG 7. I spent a lot of time, as you know from our previous conversations, thinking about energy. And there's a lot of emphasis on delivering clean access to electricity for everyone as part of SDG 7. Well, one of the things about energy technologies is that, in fact, nobody really cares about energy. They care greatly about the services that energy can provide. They really don't care about energy itself, right? And so one of the things I like to talk about with respect to SDG 7 is you should never do an SDG 7 project on its own. You should never deploy energy for the sake of deploying energy. You should always link that deployment of an energy project to creating other kinds of SDG outcomes, right? So think about how you're going to use an energy project to enhance food security. How are you going to use an energy project to drive economic growth? How are you going to use an energy project to reduce inequalities in a community, right? So how do you leverage that relationship between energy services and the other things that households and communities are trying to achieve? And if you can think about how your energy project delivers on a whole bunch of different SDG outcomes for these folks, then you begin to really see the opportunities for creating social value. And this is true of any technology project as well. I mean, yes, to Facebook, there is a benefit to bringing information systems into people's lives in order to get their eyeballs so that they can advertise to them, right? So Facebook has an interest in people sitting around consuming information for the purpose of consuming information. But very few other people really should care much about information for the purposes of information. We care about information because access to information enables us to do things. It enhances our capabilities if it contributes to improving our food security, if it contributes to improving our water security, if it contributes to our ability to grow a business, right? So when we think about technology innovation, we need to get outside the bubble of technology for technology's sake, technology for speed's sake, right? And think about technology for the purposes of creating different kinds of value in people's lives. And if you do the work to understand how is my work on this technology project actually in day-to-day use going to help this community enhance its food security, right? If you do that work to really understand that causal chain and to make sure that that causal chain functions, then you'll actually deliver that value to the customer that we were talking about in the second kind of approach, right? So it's, I think all of these are efforts to really decenter our focus in technology projects from the technology itself. We spend a lot of time engineering these technologies, which we have to do because of course you have to get the technical systems right, but we have to also do the work. And it's the same level of hard work to make sure that we're designing the relationships between the technology and the community in order to help the community achieve the outcomes that they want to achieve. So in implementing this, we've developed what we call a multi-layer approach to project design. And I'm just going to walk you through these layers here, hopefully pretty quickly, and open it up for a conversation. So the layers that we think about kind of move outwards like an onion. And so at the center is this question of the productive and valuable use of your technology, or here I put energy, just energy as an example again. But again, it can be any technology innovation that you're working with, right? So what is it that's productive or valuable about that, the use of that technology, right? And then the next layer out is to think about what are the services that are required in order to enable that. And I'll give you an example here in a second. And then once we have those services, right? So services in the case of energy, right? Energy services are, light, heat, cooking, power, powering equipment, right? Those are the things that people care about. The actual services, right? You don't need electricity in your home. You need light at night in your home, right? You don't need electricity. You need a cook stove that can use that, turn that electricity into controlled heat for the purposes of cooking, right? So that's what I mean by services. So what are those socially valuable services that are needed in order to create the outcome, the valuable outcome for the community? Then how do you need to design the social and the technical systems to work together to create those services, right? So if I want a water pump out in the field, I got to figure out how am I going to deliver that service, the mechanical energy to pump the water out in the field, not in the home, right? That's a socio-technical system. And then somebody's got to know how to use that system, and they probably got to know how to repair that system too, because otherwise when it breaks, you know, it's just going to quit, and then we'll be back to where we started. So then the fourth level is, what are the workforces and organizations or enterprises that we need to create to make this system work, right? So we got to have somebody who's trained to install and repair, for example, the system in question, right? And then how is ownership of that structured? Where is the money flowing? Because ultimately, in the end, one of the things that is crucial is whether net monetary flows are going into the community or coming out of the community, right? If we think back to that balance between generativity and extraction, certainly monetary flows in and out of the community are one of the big question marks about extractiveness versus generativity. And then, of course, the policy and governance space has to support that all of this design. And we need innovation ecosystems that can make all of this design, you know, that can put all of this design into working. So let me give you an example of how these layers work. So this is a project that my colleagues Netra and Nalini Chetri did in Nepal over the past few years. And it was to build a solar system in a community in Nepal that would lift water up and pump it into an set of irrigation canals to irrigate the farmers' fields, right? So that's the answer in some sense to this first question. What can we use energy to do that will be valuable? That first layer is we need an actual use of the energy that will add value to the community. In this case, you know, moving the water uphill quite a lot in order to enable this community to irrigate their fields and grow more food, right? So again, that link to, in this case, food security as well as a potential business opportunity in the sale of excess food from the community. Right, so then that second layer is socially valuable energy services, right? So the service in question here is the lifting and moving of water from the well to the field, right? And so that's what we need to be able to do. We need to be able to lift that water. We need to be able to run a water pump. And so then we need a socio-technical systems design in order to make all that work, right? So had to design, of course, a solar array that was connected to a water pump and then connect that to appropriately to a well where the water, and then the water into a set of irrigation canals that distributed that water throughout the different fields that the community owns, right? So from a technical standpoint, there was a fair bit of work to do, but also from a social standpoint, there was a fair bit of work to do in the sense that the community needed to be able to operate this pump, make sure it's functioning properly, repair it, right? So there had to be some training, some skills development. Also, crucially, there had to be a community organization that happened in order for to ensure that people paid their bills for the water to the community and in order to allocate water appropriately at different times to different fields, et cetera, right? So there was a fair bit of social work that was required at the same time in order to make this system work. That meant you needed an actual community organization that distributed responsibilities for different forms of work within this community enterprise, if you will. You needed the people who are going to do the work on the technical system, but you also needed the people who are going to take care of the billing and the accounts, right? So there was a whole collective organization here. The community itself contributed an investment into the building of the system. So you had to organize that investment process as well, right? And so they created an actual community enterprise to run this activity and to collect the money and pay the workers and so forth to have all of this function for them, right? And then, of course, there is money embedded in this. There's an ownership of the system by the community there, and the community financial requirements that go with operating it and keeping it repaired. There's the ensuring that people are contributing financially to the operation and that they're getting the water services that they are paying for from it and so forth, and understanding how those flows are working and to what extent they're staying in or leaving the community, to what extent they're functioning as a form of reinvestment, where the community is then able over time to do more with the enterprise. And of course, right, thinking about what kinds of policies the government of Nepal needs to undertake in order to grow these kinds of enterprises throughout the Nepalese landscape, right? That allows communities to own and operate these kinds of mini electricity systems, micro hydro systems, micro solar systems, and so forth, right? And of course, right, a whole innovation ecosystem, and that was where ASU was part of enabling this to happen, that entailed really working with the community to think through how to do all of this in a way that would empower the community, that would create new capabilities for the community. And then, of course, bringing in the entities that were capable of supporting that, right? So bringing in the various groups that contributed financially to supporting this project, bringing in the solar company that designed and built the solar system with the community, right? So it's got to be a whole innovation ecosystem if these kinds of things are going to happen, right? So this is a layered approach that goes from thinking about the valuable use of a new technology all the way out to what are the policies and the ecosystem of actors, right? The suppliers, the installers, et cetera, that are needed in order to create these kinds of new energy or new technology arrangements that grow people's capabilities. So with that, thanks very much for the listening here this morning, and I look forward to the rest of the conversation. Questions, comments?
All right. Morning, Professor and fellow colleagues. Let me just say that this is wonderful. As much as I would have had a thought, or we would have been including something similar in our documents, this is now more concrete. This is now, we know it's workable and it's proven technology or proven methodology. So again, thank you, because when we conceptualize the power being, let me say, an innovation or a solution, we saw all the other spin-offs and we're wondering, how far do we go into the other SDGs? So this is showing us that, yes, probably to a certain level, but definitely it has a spin-off benefit. Energy must not just be energy. It must add value on the other side, poverty, food, and even ICT and other businesses, because this is where probably the question is. In some of these communities at the margins, how do you find helping them out to get to that next level where they can add value? Workshops, some kind of seminars? Do you have to inject additional capital into other things? Let me say like a small internet business, some education, side internet stuff. How do you see that that going? Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Mahendra. And just for the reminder for everybody here, right, we've got a mixed group. And Mahendra is part of a group of folks who are at the University of Guyana and are pursuing doctoral research with us, looking at how they can lead an energy transition in Guyana. So it's really great to have them with us. Mahendra, I'm going to ask Sarab and or Lori to answer your question because they have a lot more, sort of day-to-day experience working with communities to think through how to put these ideas into practice.
Sarab, I'll let you answer first, and then I'll follow up with our particular application.
Sure. Thanks, Lori. So, thank you, Mahendra, for the question. It's an important question that you asked because the devil lies in the detail of translating concepts to practices, particularly in situations where there are constraints of resources and time. So I'll recall the experience from a project that we did a couple of years ago with practitioners in 4 different countries around the world. These were small businesses working very closely with communities. And they were interested in utilizing the concept of social value and creating benefits with energy and on the other dimensions. So we started with exchanging ideas. And I think one of the important platforms that we were able to build was this platform of exchanging ideas, which brings together experience. So these small businesses, they had lots of experience working on the ground. They had access to data. They had people who were spending time every day with communities. So they had a lot of information. They had a lot of implicit knowledge about the place, the geography. What we were able to do was through this information exchange platform, we were able to provide them a template of putting their thoughts and their information on the table, look at it in a systematic fashion, and then identify from the information what are the potential areas of creating benefits. We call this, as from the figure that Clark shared in his presentation of how the different SDGs link, we call this the co-benefits approach. So identifying what kind of co-benefits are achievable immediately through energy, water pumping, drinking water, lighting, and what kind of productive uses it can lead to. And then also working on that information as to the second, the third levels of additional benefits that can be created. So yes, the capacity to think and the toolkits to put information in a systematic visualization is important. Second, it's important to have different perspectives, people who bring in different kinds of information and different kinds of specialities onto the table. And then, of course, one of the key challenges is the availability of resources to do this kind of work. A lot of project financing would not cover these activities. So this is a constant struggle in financing as to how to include money for doing this kind of work. And then, of course, you need the institutional buy-in from funders and other regulating agencies. I think these would be the key opportunities, also the key barriers of translating this concept to practice. Over to you, Lori.
Okay, thank you, Sarab. So yeah, so the environment that Sarab is talking about is the same environment that we're operating in, definitely, mostly in Africa. And from the perspective, just to provide a container, These types of activities we consider early stage project development. This is before the project is bankable, and all of the work that you have to do to help it move towards bankability. And as Rob said, it's not a space that's actually funded typically, right? So when we think about projects, Mahindra, in your scenario, like Guyana, we basically focus on where we see there is already existing economic activity, value chains that are informal, that we can assist through formalization and scaling up, help drive development. So in Africa, we're focusing on small scale farming and artisanal mining, which we know that Guyana also has, as many do, as many of the developing countries do. And so we essentially start with the premise of an economic project, and then all the different things, energy that's required to do production and so on and so forth, are embedded into that, which gives us an automatic production use, obviously, of the energy or the telecommunications or any, if we want to call, infrastructure, right? And as a part of that process, to ensure that it has social value and inclusion, we then include the community in what we call participative prospecting, which is really just data collection, but it's a nice name, right? And in our case, because we're working in those value chains, they're able to tell us information like the miners about themselves. They're able to tell us information about the land. They're able to tell us information about their communities. And basically, just like Saurabh, creating a platform where they can enter that information and in order to share, but also to be able to, at some point, because many will not be able to do it at the beginning, is to be able to do some analysis. So they can co-create ideas with us or even create their own ideas. So that gets to the socially generative aspect in incorporating data in the early stages. And what most people do not understand about the project development process is that data is everything to proving a project, good data, right? And so one of the things that we're trying to work on in shifting is by enabling communities and local people to provide systematic quality data throughout the project process, is to enable them to be not passive participants in project development, whether it's a small scale project, like you were talking about, just the energy, the irrigation system, or whether it's a larger scale industrial project. So they become valued partners in the process, and thereby causing institutions who have money when they do development projects, for example, to carve out money for data collection, where there's money that can help support the systematic data collection that's necessary for really any project at any scale. And where it also creates another revenue stream for the communities and those participating, because they're providing important local information that's important to the project and obviously the community as a whole. So it's kind of changing that paradigm. But in the respect of the process of ensuring the social value and all of that, while we put in things for production, for example, to help the miners, to help us manage and all of that, which includes having sources of energy for production, having better tools, putting in a wireless broadband network that can provide high speed, not internet access, but local access to content and data, that we can take that and then provide the community with that same infrastructure, and then include them in the data collection that's needed to continually develop the project, which now means that they're learning not only the skills for the data collection, and then they have access to the tools, but it also helps give them some ideas about generating their own projects and their own ideas using the same methods. So for us, that's how, at least in the early stages, that we kind of embed the idea of first the economic project, then looking at the social value, then also ensuring that it's socially generative. And one thing that we haven't quite done yet is look at, we just kind of inherently know that we're touching a lot of the SDGs just because of the way that we do integrated development. But that's a very good point. We need to go through that process in order to make some direct linkages. So I hope that helps to answer some of your question. I don't know. Let me know if you have any thoughts or additional questions.
Yeah, well, just to clarify, I think this is great, the conversation, because initially I was just thinking to suggest the social value in a sense, and basically the funding, everything goes into the energy project. So now I have to rethink that, and probably upfront, because usually when you ask for money and then you gotta go back when this project done, now it got another project. You need money for the agriculture side, you need money for pump, you need money, let me say, if I put some equipment in place to do some local manufacturing, converting some of the product they get like cassava and provision to some value added, right? So instead of having to go back for money, I think it's good to put it in there one, because you will start small, so it would be small scale equipment. But it's good to get that in there rather than hope you get some savings and use it for that. So interesting, very interesting, because it's something that I did not think as far, let me say, at this point. So it's better to ask up front, and I get that from you guys, because down the road it can end up becoming another hassle.
Great.
Thanks again.
And let me just add one point. One reason why we choose economic projects, such as farming or artisanal mining, is that they can actually help bring money in for further development. So oftentimes they're already making money, but they need to scale up, they need to do different things. So if you could make it a bankable economic project, then all of the other social value things that you want to include on your project, you can have money at least to do the early stage development. Part of that, because you're generating revenue, you're sharing in that revenue that the farmers are making, because you're providing them a better platform for production or for, selling their product wherever, right? And then you can use part of that money to do further development. Because the one issue that we found was finding money in early stage. Doesn't matter if you're on the energy side or any side, right? It's very hard. And the amount of funds that are made available for that are very small. And so the best way to deal with that is to be generating your own revenue, where you can take part of that so that you can do further development to develop more projects. So that's the problem that we present, that presented itself to us, why we made this choice and strategy.
Yeah, Lori, that recursive reinvestment I've seen that multiple times, be an incredibly important component of generative projects, right? And so designing that in is so critically important. So, just another example, we were working in, or are working in Puerto Rico with a community that has operated a community water service for over a half century. And the government provides them with finances to support the operation of that community water system. And of course, the community also pays into that community water system. They'll pay for the ongoing costs and so forth. And so, right, so they've got a diversified kind of source pool of money to support that community water aqueduct. And at one point a few years ago, they were able to invest in a solar system solar and battery system that now provides most of the electricity for the pump that runs the community water aqueduct. And it does so at a significantly lower cost than the money that they were receiving from the government, still are receiving for the government to pay for the electricity. And so that extra money is now available in a pool for the community to support other community investment projects. And they've been able to do a whole bunch of other things with those additional financial resources that they have to really help boost the community services. So that kind of recursive investment is really, really important. So thanks for sharing. Patrick.
Hi, good morning, everyone. I have a fair amount of experience with the same kind of stuff. In Guyana, the Latin American NGO organization, ULADE, would have done 2 sets of projects along the similar line. However, one of the things is that we went into communities that really didn't have any background in these kinds of in any kind of enterprise like this. So what we did is actually went into the community, had discussions with them, and see where their capabilities were in terms of being able to scale it up and commercialize it. So it's a case of where we went into maybe the second poorest community in Guyana, in the Rupununi, right? And what happened is that the whole idea was to do the same community consultations, but what we did is that we tried to find out what were their strengths, what they can do good. And based on that, it was decided among themselves, because one of the good things about them is they already had working groups. They had women's group, mainly women's group, and they were involved in various things. So one of the biggest things that they had was what we were referring to as the farine production group. That is from cassava, right? They grind it. But to do it, they do it in a batch form. And because they have no kind of any kind of mechanization, it takes forever. So what they did is that, so one of the things we decided is to give them a mill, and also worked with them to let them understand how you could do batches, not wait until one batch is finished to start the other, but where you could do them kind of in parallel and those kinds of things. So, and they were able to use that to build a community. The other thing we did is that we had actually set up each group as a legally official group. So they had to be registered and all of that. And they were part of a bigger Woweta business group. So that was an NGO. And so the same thing that you were talking about, getting financing, the seed money was from ULADE. And what they did is that each group had to pay back a certain amount of their earnings into the central fund. So you had a revolving fund. So those, and we end up doing not just that group, we end up doing other groups. One of the things also is that they needed lights in the home. So because they said they can do more craft work in the evenings when they have the lights. So we also gave them solar lights. Basically, we didn't give them an inverter because we know you tend to abuse inverters. So it's basically just lights. And they were able to upgrade their crafts, and they were able to now sell the craft. The other thing that happened with that solar lantern coming from the teachers was that the students were very enthused, and they would stay up at night and study, and it actually improved their ability at school. So that's in a nutshell what happened. I keep promising to share some of the documents. I think I'll pass it on eventually. I keep forgetting. So that's basically my experience. And we did another one not so long ago in some other villages where ULADE used the same approach. And they were basically successful.
Thanks, Patrick. Appreciate you sharing. Arthur.
Thanks, Clark. Just yeah, on a different sort of note. Yeah, thanks. Interesting presentation. Can I just invite you to maybe comment a bit more, you or Saurabh, on your experiences with, you know, the three strategies of thinking of, you know, social value. You know, when faced with, you know, a project or a potential situation for the application, what have you found to be perhaps the best approach to take in terms of, you know, identifying a strategy? Does one identify one of those three strategies that may be most suitable for that particular type of project or circumstance? You know, or is it like there's, you know, perhaps a certain approach that might be more suitable for certain stages of development of that project? Or, you know, one can just, you know, apply, you know, two or three or all three of them, you know, concurrently. And if that's the case, you know, what have you, what has been your experience in terms of seeing, you know, perhaps maybe a correlation in terms of, you know, the results that the results of the extent or impact that each one of those three strategies seems to bring out in, you know, in terms of the value created?
It's a great question, Arthur. I've never really thought about it in quite those terms. So I guess my kind of inclination is to think about them as complementary. You know, I would say sort of the second one. So maybe I should reorder them. The second one, the idea of you know, creating value for your customers, right? I think of as a kind of orientation, right? And that's why I think I like the kind of lean startup analogy, because the whole idea of kind of lean startup methodology is, hey, orient your head around your job is to figure out what you can do that can create value for your customers. And you want to think about that all the time. You want to talk to your customers all the time, or your potential customers all the time, to figure out what are their problems, what are their challenges, what are their needs, right? So I think of that one as kind of an orientation, right? It's a stance that a project developer or an innovator should sort of be taking to their customers and the relationship between what they're doing and their customers. Then second, I would adopt the SDG type approach as a concrete project design approach, right? So there, the question, in a sense, is go down the list of the SDGs and say, well, okay, so how can this project that I'm developing, an information systems project or an energy project or a water project, how can it contribute to, you know, SDG 1? How can it contribute to SDG 2? How can it contribute to SDG 3? And you could kind of actually make it an exercise where you're working with your community that you're partnered with to say, well, you know, what could we do here? And it may be that, you know, coming out of that conversation, 2 or 3 of them leap to the front as places where there would be easy wins and real value created for the community, right? And so you could kind of use that as a you know, brainstorming kind of early phase project design kind of tactic. And then I would think about the kind of mathematical approach, right? The summing of costs and benefits. That's a little bit later in the project when you've kind of built a sense of what you think you might want to do. And at that point, you then start, you know, trying to crunch the numbers and say, is this really going to be net generative for the community, or do we need to adapt our model or our design for the project in ways that reduce the costs and risks, or on the other hand, increase the benefits for the community. So you can kind of use it as an evaluative tool. And indeed, you can keep using it as an evaluative tool along the way, because you can, it can kind of be a constant feedback loop, so that as the project evolves and things get added to it, you can constantly kind of be checking yourself or get the community to check for themselves. Is this working well enough? Or do we need to think about how do we reorient the benefits and costs in favor, to kind of tilt things more in favor of the community as we go along. So that'd be my quick kind of thinking about those three approaches and how they could be used together. Sarb, I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
Well, so far I have tried to avoid a prescription.
Right.
Use on how to use the value of energy approach and the concept as models. I am more so I work, one of the key underpinnings of the concept of social value is that it's a process of discovery. The relationship between technology or technology services and human development outcomes is a process of discovery. So it's never one project. It's a sequence or concurrent projects happening together. So what I have worked in my experience that I worked with people, I have focused more on the integration of the concept and the data tools with the operational model of that particular partner, whether it's a business, whether it's a community organization. I have focused more on the integration process so that they have been able to, develop something of their own in each particular case. Maybe that's too slow of a process of translation, and it needs a standardized approach. And perhaps, one day we'll get there. But so far, I've been more focused on the integration of the concept with the existing models of operation of the partners and have them integrate them. So, one of our partners in Nepal, they had been pushing me for the entire duration of our collaboration. They've been pushing me to give them a spreadsheet, a prescription of how to do stuff. And I've kept on telling them, yes, we will arrive at a prescription, a checklist that you will be able to use. And then eventually, through the process of engagement, they ended up developing their own checklist. So that has been my approach. I don't know if this answers your question, Arthur, but that's how I have been approaching translation so far.
Thanks, Sarb. We have one more question from Prasamsa.
Hello, everyone. I feel like the question I have was mostly answered by Saurav. Thank you so much. And giving some sort of background, I did my research in synergy and trade-off between sustainable development goals, where I focused in energy and climate change. And one of the major issues I faced while doing that research was the lack of data, particularly in developing country like Nepal. So what my question is, when we are trying to study the impact of developmental tools such as solar or Place One, how do we identify the area or group of people? How do we identify the area or the group of people or communities when there are so many of them? And also one of the major problems, as I've mentioned, working in developing countries, are the lack of data or the lack of cooperation or collaboration. So how do we find a place of need or place where we can ensure positive feedback? Do we collaborate with the developmental partners that are already working, or how do we supposedly tap into an untapped area or untapped communities? And to see the positive feedback, it takes certain years, I guess. And I suppose, how do we ensure active participation from communities ranging from local and national level? Thank you.
Thanks, Prasamsa. I mean, those are really important questions. And you know, I don't know that I have
You're blessed
simple,
with so many questions.
you know, sort of boilable down, easy answers to any of those. But you know, a lot of our work has, for better and worse, been highly opportunistic. So maybe Lori, you might have something to say about how are there strategies for project site selection that you use that could usefully guide that kind of decision making? I mean, I think the challenge, of course, is not just to find those places where we think generativity is, you know, easier as opposed to harder, so that we can do that, but to figure out how strategies can be applied
Yeah.
broadly so that we can reach even the hardest places. So. Okay, so Lori unfortunately had to head off to another meeting, which totally understandable. I think these will be questions, Prashant, so that will continue to arise throughout the rest of the session. So I encourage you to keep asking that question and keep forcing people to engage with it, because it's critically important how to think about how we can bring these kinds of generative practices to lots and lots and lots of different kinds of places.